All right, thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. I'm a native Californian, born in Children's Hospital in San Francisco. Been living back east since '71. I love it here. Michael's asking me, why don't you move back? Can't afford it. Rent's too damn high. My brother's, I can stay with him in Oakland. I got a niece in San Diego, a sister up in Seattle. So I plan to spend a lot of time out here if I get the Green nomination, because there was the whole 3 million vote difference between Clinton and Trump. California accounted for. So there are a lot of votes here that I think are available to vote for real change. I didn't seek to run. I was asked by a lot of Greens around the country, from my good late friend Bruce Dixon, who was the managing editor of Black Agenda Report out in Atlanta, to Mac Gonzalez. I don't know if you heard of him. He almost was the next mayor of San Francisco, almost beat Gavin Newsom.
As a Green.
As a Green, right. And a whole lot of people in between. And they convinced me to run. It's not what I planned for retirement. I'm a retired Teamster. I was a construction worker before that, but I wanted to catch up on all the books I buy faster than I can read. But here I am, and I think it was mentioned, or maybe we were talking about it, I was the first candidate to run on the Green New Deal in 2010. And it was an anti-austerity program. I'm running against Governor Cuomo, now the governor of New York, and he was claiming to be the real Tea Party candidate. You know, not tax the rich, cut education, cut public employment. This is coming out of the Great Recession. The Green New Deal was the Hawkins prosperity plan versus the Cuomo austerity plan. And we got a ballot line out of it. I eventually got 5% in 2014, and then Cuomo came our way. Ban on fracking, $15 minimum wage, paid family leave. He said he went for tuition-free public college. He didn't, but he talked like it. Even Bernie Sanders came out when he unveiled his scholarship program, which is anything but that. And the point is, we're able to move to politics. And so we have two objectives, and these people that drafted me to run, they put together a campaign. We agreed on two objectives. One is to build the Green Party. So it's going to be really tough for a third party. Anybody but Trump is on people's minds. Trump is a moral midget. He lies every time he opens his mouth. He's 20 points behind on approval ratings against any Democrats. The Democrats should crush him. They're going to spend billions. We're going to be lucky to spend a few million. And if they can't do that, they can't do anything. So what the Greens got to be in a position coming out of 2020 is to start electing thousands of Greens to public office. We have 150. It's more than any third party on the left since the old socialists. But there's over 500,000 offices up for election in this country. Most of them local. Got to build this from the bottom up. Elect local people, then state legislature, and then a caucus in Congress. And when we got that, when somebody runs for president as a Green, the public and the media will pay attention. So what we got to do to be able to run those local candidates is get ballot lines. 39 of the 51 ballots, counting DC, are affected by the presidential race. So for no other reason, that's why we got to run, so we can build this thing from the bottom up and be ready in the 2020s to step forward. Because we face three life and death issues that the major parties have not solved, in fact, have made worse. It's the climate crisis, the inequality crisis, and the new nuclear arms race. So it's a party building exercise, but we want to try to inject some of these issues. So we got a Green New Deal program that we call it the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal program. We got to do what this country did during World War II to defeat the fascist Axis powers. The federal government took over and either built or took over from GM and Ford and companies like that, a quarter of the manufacturing capacity of the country. They told the owners to go take a vacation. They brought in the technicians and they planned the building of the arsenal of democracy is what they called it. So they had the weaponry and the war material to defeat the fascists. And we need to do nothing less now. We don't have time to mess around with regulations and standards and tax incentives. We got to build the clean economy. And so this is an outline of what we call the Green Economy Reconstruction Program. The Green New Deal is both that and an economic bill of rights, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the climate crisis is an existential crisis. It's not just more heat waves and stronger storms. It's mass extinctions, the collapse of ecosystems, and therefore agriculture, and therefore our civilization. It's a climate holocaust we're facing. And if you heard Greta Thunberg at the UN, schooling the ambassadors to the UN on the carbon budget, I mean, when we ran in 2010, we were saying 100% greenhouse gas reductions in clean energy by 2020, because that's what the climate scientists like Hansen in this country and Anderson in the UK and others were saying. rich countries should do so we had a chance to get back below 350 or even 300 parts per million. That's what the German group said. The climate safe zone, parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We got to 415 last spring. So we're past the safe zone. The objective is to stop emitting this stuff and then draw it down through natural carbon sequestration, afforestation, organic agriculture to rebuild the soils and sequester carbon in the soil, rebuilding habitat like mangroves and wetlands. But that's probably not going to be enough. If you look at Hanson's latest paper, it's called Climate Change in a Nutshell. It's actually 60 dense pages, but they call it the nutshell paper. He says if we do all that natural carbon sequestration, there's just enough capacity to draw enough carbon down by the end of the century to get below 350 parts per million. We're probably not going to make that. So we also have in here a carbon mineralization program, and that's basically to speed up the natural carbon cycle, the geological carbon cycle, where carbon dioxide solidifies as carbonates in Earth's crust. And we can do that by taking carbonated water and putting it in basaltic rock formations, and after 2 years, 95% of it will be hard, carbonates stuck in the rock. It's not going anywhere for geological time frames. So we're facing an existential crisis. So the Green Economy Reconstruction Program, 100% clean energy by 2030, but that's only 28% of the carbon emissions. So we also got to deal with these sectors. You look at the other Green New Deal programs, and they talk about these other sectors by 2050. That's 72% of the carbon. That's too late. So we build 100% clean energy, a public energy system. We have public utilities instead of investor-owned utilities, IOUs like PG&E. We don't let the Koch brothers and Chevron reinvest their profits from fossil fuel sales or refining into more fossil fuels. We take them over and put them into renewables during the transition where we'll still be using some fossil fuels. And then green buildings, that's 9%. So we have to retrofit buildings for electric heat pumps instead of burning gas to heat and cool. We need some solar electricity and storage. We want walkable communities. So in conjunction with the transportation system, we can build a lot of public housing so we have affordable housing. We do it the right way, mixed income, we can segregate. It's a jobs program, it's a clean energy program, as well as an affordable housing program. And we place these developments next to the network, the hubs and spokes of a public transportation system. We call it interstate, that's federal, it's federated, we have local boards, state boards, and national boards, so it's controlled from the bottom up, the whole planning process is. And we rebuild the trolleys. LA had the greatest trolley system in the world before World War II, and it was a conspiracy. They were found guilty of, tearing that system up and substituting buses, which weren't very good, so they could sell cars. That was GM and the rubber companies and the oil companies. So we have a federal railroad administration controlling the whole system. The trolleys, the light rails in the cities, high-speed intercity rail, these bullet trains like China, Europe, Japan have, we don't. And then we convert freight transportation to electrified rails. And then you have electric vehicles for the last leg of the journey from the rail hub to wherever it's going, whether it's people or freight. So we're building electric cars, regional transit, high speed, this is the bullet trains. And so that's almost a third, 29%. Then we go to the agricultural sector. We got to convert, and our program is we subsidize the transition of farmers to organic agriculture. We get corporate farms off the land. We have parity pricing and farm price supply management program. So every farmer is guaranteed a livable income above their cost of production. Civilian Conservation Corps. This is 4 million jobs. That's rebuilding habitat, cleaning up pollution, and so forth. We need more water infrastructure. I mentioned the carbon mineralization. And finally, we get to manufacturing. And this is something we do that none of the other Green New Deal plans do. Our manufacturing is gone. We don't even have a machine tool industry, which builds the equipment for intermediate goods production and consumer goods production. So we're going to rebuild that in the public sector. What we'll do different than World War II is after World War II, all those plants they built were managing, They gave them back to the super rich and their corporations for pennies on the dollar. It was a big subsidy to the rich. Instead, we're going to keep them in public ownership, but lease them to worker co-ops, so workers can get the full fruit of their labor when they work in these Green New Deal factories, which we want to put in every congressional district like the military industrial complex did with the military. We're going to have a green industrial complex. So the two things that distinguish this is we have a big public sector to build this stuff out. It's the only way we can do it in the time frame we're facing. And we're going to rebuild manufacturing, which nobody's really talking about, because we got to change cement. Cement is 5 to 8% of the greenhouse gases in the world. China just poured, in 3 years, more cement than the United States poured through the whole 20th century. It's a big problem. And there are ways of doing it. The Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation, they have a community college. They got a way of doing cement with iron dust and ground up glass silica instead of calcium carbonate, which heats and Portland cement and goes into the atmosphere. We need to scale that up. Or like steel production, instead of coke ovens, electric arc furnaces. The industry's moving that way. You know, coke is kind of like coal, and they heat it up, and it releases a lot of carbon. But they want, if they do it on their own timeline, then they're gonna wear out the stuff they got, the coke ovens they got, before they put in the electric arc furnaces. It'll be too late. So that's the whole Green Economy Reconstruction Program. And see if we can scroll up a little bit. So stop right there. So over 30 million jobs, including, 8.7 million jobs in manufacturing. So this is, the bottleneck in doing this in a time frame is not the technology, we mostly have it. Not the capital, I'll talk about where we get the money. It's labor. To do it on a time frame, we're going to need more people than we got to do the work. And then the Economic Bill of Rights. These are the things that Franklin Roosevelt called for in his last two State of the Union addresses, 1944 and 1945, asked Congress to enact. They had Democratic majorities with the president. For every Democrat, from Truman to Obama, they never did any of them. So we're talking about the right to a job with government as employer last resort. An income above poverty, probably a negative income tax, where if you're below poverty line, when you turn your taxes, you get a check every month to get you up to poverty. A secure retirement. We want to double Social Security benefits. That's probably the quickest way to do it. Medicare for all. We don't just want socialized insurance, we want a socialized system where the doctors are on salary, working for the public, in public clinics and hospitals. There was a bill that Ron Dellins put in, and Barbara Lee carried until Obamacare passed, called the Josephine Butler United States Healthcare Service. We can talk more about that, why it's superior. It's better cost control, and it's democratically accountable because local health boards are elected by the public and the healthcare providers. Homes for all, that's the public housing, and it's an immediate thing we need to have, universal rent control. We did it at the federal level during World War II. We're putting all the investment into weapons. We weren't building housing, rents were going up, so we had federal rent control. And then lifelong public education and universal access to the internet. So we're gonna build a high-speed internet system. The schools, the schools we got need some investment. And then universal child care and pre-K before you get to the elementary schools. And then adult education is not just academic education, but technical education and continuing education for adults. So that's, and I didn't talk about the total. So 2.7 trillion a year, or 27 trillion over 10 years for the Green Economy Reconstruction Fund. The only one that's serious among the Democrats is Bernie Sanders. I'm not gonna do this in 10 minutes, but I'll just keep going. The Democrats already killed the Green New Deal. Sunrise Movement and AOC went to Pelosi's office. It went viral. We did a poll in December. 80% of the people want it, including 64% of the damn Republicans. And Pelosi killed it. The select committee, she chopped and sliced and diced and threw that down in the scope. They came back with a non-binding resolution after the first of the year when Congress opened up. And they took our brand, this has been the Green signature issue for a decade, and diluted the content. No ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure. If we don't do that, they're going to build new structure, we'll be burning these fossil fuels for 3, 4, 5 decades, and it'll be too late. Nuclear power, we said phase it out, they didn't say anything. The timeline, they extended it to 2050 for all the sectors except electricity. And we called for deep cuts in military spending. I'm calling for 75% cut. Jill Stein was calling for 50% cut, but it's a basic idea. And they didn't say anything about that in this non-binding resolution. And then Pelosi won't even let them vote on it in the House. And she sent, the climate issues to some committees she formed with people chairing them who get money from the fossil fuel industry. But wily old speaker or leader McConnell said, oh, you Democrats, we'll let you vote on it in the Senate because half of you are running for president. And Markey and Schumer said, oh, that's a trick. We want expert witnesses, we want to build support, but they have to vote. So Schumer's holding them vote president. And all those good little Democrats voted president instead of for the Green New Deal. Except for them. They voted with the Republicans again. So it's been defeated in the Democratic Party. So that's the economic reconstruction. The good thing that Sunrise and AOC did is they kept the economic bill of rights in there. It's not detailed, it's aspirational, but that's key because if we're going to convince people we got to make these radical changes in the economy, they want to be assured of their economic security. And the economic bill of rights helps do that. So that total is $1.4 trillion a year. That's pay-as-you-go. Revenues to the government should cover that. So then the question is, how do you pay for it? So we've got suggestions for progressive tax reform and come up with $2.2 trillion. That's a good start. And then we're going to have to borrow or create money to pay for the difference because if we don't, it's even worse. Because the cost to an economy where agriculture is collapsing and production, our economy is based on natural environmental services. And if they start collapsing, the whole economy is really in trouble. And we're in a climate holocaust. So we've got to make these investments. Now, there are two ways to do it. One is to do like we did with quantitative easing to bail out the banks. This time we bail out the people in the planet. So Treasury sells bonds. The Fed can support that by creating money on their books and buying those bonds out of the market and putting them on their assets. That was called quantitative easing. So we can do green quantitative easing. But what we prefer to do is the whole demand for greenbacks. The federal government's public money. It doesn't have a debt attached to it because those bonds, when you do the quantitative easing, the taxpayers eventually got to pay them back. You may have heard of modern money theory, and they say we can borrow pretty much all we want because we're the reserve currency in the world right now. The problem is, and they don't talk about it so much, eventually you got to pay that back. And that squeezes money out of other parts of the federal budget or even private investment. So we would prefer, and we have a plank in the Green Party in this country and also in England and Wales, to create public money, or what they called during the populist movement between the Civil War and early 1900s, greenbacks. We issued greenbacks to help fund the Civil War, and they wanted the greenbacks to fund agriculture and industry when the banks wanted tight money and there was actually deflation, so the money borrowed, you had to pay back more than it was in real terms than when you borrowed it. So either way, we need to raise that money and with public banks. So if it's under the current monetary theory or system, the banks can do fractional reserve lending like the private banks do. But because it's under public control directly toward what the people want. And if it's the greenback, we get that reform passed, we just put money in those banks which they can lend out under community control or state control. I know California just passed enabling legislation for public banks, which is a good step. So, and then if we can get about $770 billion, 75% cut in military spending, $550 billion, that's just the Department of Defense. It doesn't count like nukes in the Energy Department. Cut back on the war on drugs, $60 billion a year. Abolish ICE, we want open borders. So we need a whole new agency. ICE and the Border Patrol are corrupt and they're full of bigots. And then there's funds redirected from the safety net because if we have a job guarantee, we don't need unemployment insurance. If we have a guaranteed minimum income, we don't need the earned income tax credit. So there's some programs like that where we have savings. And then in the long run, we don't put the numbers in, but we're producing electricity. So people don't pay for their electricity. We're going to produce machinery, the green machinery, and sell that. Fares for the public transportation system. Rents and sales of public housing. And these are more equipment and then billing for internet. And we didn't put prices on there because some things we may want to provide it below cost, like public transportation, public housing for poor people, and renewable electricity. So, but the point is, we're going to be producing a lot of things of value and selling them. And so over the long run, this system should pay for itself. Now, Bernie Sanders has a program, so we're 4.2 trillion, but scroll back up to the green, because Bernie's got his economic bill of rights separate from his Green New Deal, but that's good, it's all there. 2.7 trillion, Bernie says 16.3 trillion over 10 years. And he doesn't show his numbers. When you go to our website, and this is not what's on my website, there will be a summary like this, but you would click like on the interstate high-speed rail system, and you'll see an explanation of how much, why we think it'll cost this much, how many jobs it will create, and where we got our data for all of these sectors. So we show our homework. Bernie doesn't, but looking at his numbers, we think he's in the ballpark. The difference is he's waiting for 2050 for these sectors and 2030 for that one. That's why he didn't spend as much in 10 years. The other Democrats forget about it. I mean, they're 1 to 3 trillion public spending, and that's just like the prime private investment, and it's based on regulations, mandates, and tax incentives. And of course, the billionaire class is going to resist that, as they have this whole period where we've been debating whether there even is a climate crisis. So, the other Democratic programs, aren't even serious. Bernie's pretty serious, but he needs to go a little faster. And the other thing I'll say about Bernie, he includes the ban on fracking and fossil fuel infrastructure, phasing out nuclear power. He talks about cutting military spending. It needs to be an international program. We got a global Green New Deal. So he spends $200 billion over 10 years. We're spending $100 billion a year, $1 trillion over 10 years. Because let's face it, we can do everything right, and China's building 700 coal plants for its roads and belts initiative. India's growing at 5% greenhouse gas emissions. Russia's out of its mind. It's a petro state. They just launched 2 nukes on barges into the Arctic Ocean. They're going to park near Alaska, and then that's going to power Arctic oil and gas drilling. That Putin's a climate denier. So we got to have an international program, and I think we can do it politically because most of the nations of the world, the poor nations, are hit hard by climate change. They want a faster timeline, and we should be providing incentives and sophisticated diplomacy, really, to get China, Russia, India, and the Gulf states on board for a global transformation. So that's the Green New Deal. So now, I say there are 3 life and death issues. Climate crisis, inequality. Inequality kills. We have a 20-year life expectancy gap between our richest and poorest counties. Inequality's been growing since the 70s. Neither party has a program that even begins to deal with that. So we talk about eco-socialism. We need to do it to plan the energy conversion, but we also need it to deal with inequality. We need worker co-ops and public enterprises where workers get the full fruit of their labor so that income is distributed equitably in the first place. All an economic bill of rights can do is partially ameliorate the inequality that's unjustly generated right at the beginning of production. And you're going to have a discussion of capitalism. I could say more about what's wrong with capitalism, how it grows like cancer on the biosphere, so it's incompatible with ecology, how the competition between nation states generates out of this competitive economy and creates wars, the exploitation I just talked about, you don't get the full fruit of your labor, and capitalists, they're living off your labor, and some other things. There's a third issue, and that's the new nuclear arms race. And we have got out of all these nuclear treaties, from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2003 to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Meanwhile, initiated under Obama, continued under Trump, we're in a nuclear modernization program to update the strategic weapons in the submarines, land, and air. They're going to be 7 times faster than before. There's no time to even see if you get a radar showing nukes are coming to check and see if it's real or a mistake. You're going to launch on warning. And then you're putting tactical nukes into conventional forces more than ever. They've always been there, but they're miniaturizing them. And the military doctrines are that we can use these tactical nukes in conventional wars without triggering a strategic nuclear war, which will kill us all. This is madness. Now, in the meantime, there was an international campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons that got a treaty agreed to in the wording by 122 nations called the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, passed in 2017. The campaign that got that got the Nobel Peace Prize. And I doubt there's 1 in 1,000 Americans even knows that. This issue of nuclear Armageddon is not being talked about by any of the candidates. So what I'm advocating, and I'm running on, and I'm urging Greens running for Congress and even local office, we need to pledge no first use, a minimum credible deterrent, unilaterally disarm down to that, so we have a deterrent, but we're not threatening people with a first strike, and then gets serious about getting the nuclear powers. There's 122 nations, none of the nuclear powers are part of those negotiations. Under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty back in 1970, we were supposed to negotiate complete nuclear disarmament. That's got to be the top priority. So I'm hoping the Greens can inject that issue. So, you know, why should the Greens run? Because this stuff needs to be in the public debate. The nuclear arms issue needs to be in the public debate. And then everybody says, oh, you're going to spoil the election. No, we're going to improve the election. We're going to bring up issues that aren't being brought up. We're going to bring out people that otherwise wouldn't vote. And we got a solution to the vote splitting thing. We've been telling them for 2 decades. And that is we need a national popular vote with ranked choice voting. Yeah. The Democrats have lost to the last 2 Republicans got elected. They got less than the popular vote, those Republicans. And what have the Democrats been doing about that? The system is rigged against them, and they act like, oh, there's nothing we can do. And we can talk about the details of 2000 and 2016 and how the Democrats didn't even defend themselves. That's why we need a Green Party. The Democrats don't know how to fight the right. I'm out of time, but I could, tell you how the Obama administration enabled these banksters who were racist, predatory lenders and robo-signers. They're now in Commerce, running Commerce and Treasury departments. The war criminals that tortured, Obama wasn't going to look back. The torturers are back in the Trump administration. The only one that got prosecuted was John Kiriakou. I could keep going, but we said till 11:45. So thanks for listening, and I'd love to answer questions and answer. We may not have time, but I'll stick around after the meeting if people want to talk.
Let's extend. Let's do a Q&A.
Why don't you take a couple questions together so that he can maybe merge his answers?
Yeah.
Anybody got some questions?
Yeah.
Pearl?
Yeah, Pearl.
What's your opinion on shifting from taxing labor to taxing owned wealth?
Any other questions?
Jen, do you have a question?
Yeah. Could you explain your position on nuclear power a bit more?
Okay. And then mine is you talk about basically working up the ladder of government, starting local, state, then federal, then presidency. But the policy you talked about is like a very national policy. Most of it can only be accomplished on a national level. What is somebody who's running for like California State Assembly? How do they explain to their voters, like, what am I going to do for you now? What's my environmental justice platform in the California State Assembly?
And then last thing, could you add more about the, with farming, how you would make sure farmers got more than the production cost? I was really interested in that.
Yeah, one more over here. One more. Red.
How would you end voter suppression? I see it's on there as ideas. So how would you end voter suppression?
Voter suppression.
Okay, good. All right.
I got one question too. Since you're running for presidency, the first immediate lever of power that you have control over is our foreign policy. How would your foreign policy differ than the status quo currently when it comes to our treatment of third world countries, places like Latin America, our situation currently with Puerto Rico? How would we treat Africa, all of these places that we kind of neglect and take advantage of?
Okay. On the tax question, more taxation should shift to wealth. I mean, we have in here, you scroll up, land value tax as part of the progressive tax reforms. Well, ecological taxes, there's the land value tax. They're not making more land, so it's our common inheritance. And if you're using it, you should pay the value of the land. And that's a progressive tax. It goes back to Henry George, actually back to Thomas Paine. The income tax, I think we should keep. Adam Smith brought it up, Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto. It's a progressive way to generate some income. And, everybody, if you read the Critique of the Gotha program, where the only place where Marx really talks about what socialism would look like, everybody gets an income according to their contribution to work, but everybody has to put something in the common pot for the public services. And income, when we have a socialist economy, most of us are going to get income from work, not wealth. So I think the income tax should stay. But with the concentrated wealth we have right now, a lot of that wealth. So we got the estate tax, the wealth tax, Where's the financial transactions tax? So those are taxes on wealth. Nuclear power, even with these, thorium, molten rock reactors they keep promoting as the new thing. You got nuclear waste, you got a proliferation problem. You could have a catastrophic accident. And they cost too much, they're too slow to build, we won't make the transition fast enough. I mean, there's so many things that are wrong with nuclear power. As Avery Lovins used to say, I mean, all you're doing is boiling water. If you want molten rock, do a concentrated solar plant, or molten salt to store the heat so you can generate steam and electricity. And we got a nuclear reactor 93 million miles away that's shining right now at us. That's up to someone nuke we need. Okay, well, we're talking about federal changes, but we're not gonna have federal power in this election cycle. But we live in a federal system. Our local governments have more powers than most local governments around the world. They got the power of eminent domain, taxation, procurement. They can pass laws. We can do a lot of things to prefigure what we want done at the national level. And we can federate and demand that they act. I mean, one of the things that was really, foundational for me in understanding politics is when we were fighting the Seabrook nuclear power plant, there's this thing called the Clamshell Alliance. And we occupied the nuclear power plant site, 2,000 people on site, 1,414 arrested. They kept us in the National Guard armies for 10 days. We're on the front pages of the news weeklies and the newspapers, spread the anti-nuclear movement around the country. At that time, only 7% of the people in New Hampshire were with us against nuclear power. And then we went to the town meetings. They have, assemblies of all the townspeople. There were about 300 towns in New Hampshire with a resolution against construction works in progress. That meant you pay for the nuke before it's even up and running. And we hadn't done that for any other power plants. It wasn't the custom in the utility industry. And these rock-ribbed Republicans said, you crazy hippies that occupy that site are right. We don't want construction works in progress. We passed resolutions up and down the state in town meetings, and the governor, who was for construction works in progress, had run on it, knew politically it would kill him to pass it. So that's how, you don't have to have the formal power to have leverage. We can do a lot of things locally. Same thing at the state level. Like single payer, and this is I'm a dig at the Democrats right now. We've had 4 states where the Democrats say they're for a single payer system. And then they get both houses in the governorship. And they pass a single payer when the governor's Republican or one of the houses is Republican. And then when they get the whole power, Hawaii, California, Vermont, and now this last year, New York. Suddenly the Democrats can't do it. They got all kinds of reasons. The biggest reason is the insurance and drug companies are pouring money into their coffers. So, that's I think, you can build a lot of power without taking over the presidency and build a movement that will eventually affect that. Farm income. We had, this goes back to the populist movement and then the farmers movement in the early part of the 20th century. They called it parity pricing, and it was based on a price so that farmers would get an income above their production costs. And then they had, during the Great Depression and the agricultural programs there, they started supply management programs, because if you're a farmer in the market, you're trying to produce as much as you can and sell as much as you can. But if you get overproduction, your prices are low and you don't cover your cost of production. So you gotta have some economic planning in there. So those 2 pieces are key. And the other key piece is we gotta get corporations out of there. The farmers are becoming tenant farmers, they become dependent on like Monsanto and these seeds that don't reproduce, and then you gotta have the Roundup, the pesticides, is a terrible system. So just briefly, those are some of the things we need to do. And then the farmers, actually a lot of the farmers, even they're Trumpies and they're very conservative, but they don't like handling these poisons. They know they're getting cancer, they're getting sick. So I think, we provide the subsidies to help them transition and get their farms organic. Most of them will be with it. Voter suppression. Obviously, we have to get the pre-clearance back into the voting rights. And this is not just a Republican thing that's, putting these photo IDs and all these other laws. In Brooklyn, New York, 100,000 people suddenly were off the rolls when they had the Clinton-Sanders primary in 2016. And the Clinton machine seems to have been responsible for that. And Brooklyn was one of those pre-clearance districts because they had a history of racial discrimination. So we just can't allow them to do that without the Justice Department being able to review the impact of those changes. So that's just one step. We need proportional representation in the electoral system, so every vote counts. And you're not having this vote splitting problem. And the other thing is we need to stop party suppression. To get on a ballot in this country is harder than almost any other electoral democracy in the world. You want to run for the House of Commons, the Congress of the UK, 10 signatures. You want to run in the United States, it's thousands of signatures. Every state is different. 15 to 20,000 in some states in a limited time period. And that's why you don't have many third-party candidates. And when there aren't options there, people say, I don't believe in either party. Like this last election in 2016. They didn't like Clinton, they didn't like Trump, they stayed home. The myth is the white working class went to Trump. No, they stayed home. Next biggest group went to Stein and the Green Party and Johnson and the Libertarian Party. Very small group flipped from Obama to Trump. So party suppression is part of any voter suppression. And then foreign policy. Well, I like the phrase Ralph Nader used to use, calling for military spending cuts. The United States should be the world's humanitarian superpower instead of this global empire protecting global corporations that are based in the United States. We should, and by that policy, we can make friends instead of enemies. We've been fighting a war on terrorism or terror for 20 years. And like last week or the week before, we blew up 30 people that were, they were day laborers on a farm. And they were around a bonfire, chilling out, and a drone killed them all. You know what those families are thinking. Who the hell killed my people, and how do I get back at them? We're creating more terrorists with these drones. We're bombing 7 countries right now. We got special ops going in and assassinating people, and sometimes they get the wrong people. That's not the way to deal with it. We got to win hearts and minds. We got to provide a better alternative. What's the problem in these, Islamic countries is that the left got crushed because of U.S. and British policy. They crushed the nationalists, the socialists, and the communists, and the only thing left is an alternative to the autocracies were the Islamists. And so you got 2 right wings there, and the left is very marginalized thanks to our foreign policy. We talk about promoting democracy, we really don't. You mentioned Puerto Rico. We got a control board running the country out of Wall Street, and they're taking people's pensions so these vulture capitalists of Wall Street can get paid. Most of that debt is illegitimate and should be written off. We should decolonize the territories, starting with Puerto Rico. Virgin Islands has got a higher per capita debt rate than Puerto Rico. So, we should be the friends of people. The other thing I'll say is, there's some people that have the position that enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if Assad in Syria is against the U.S., he must be anti-imperialist. You study the Assad regime, what they did in Lebanon, what they did to their own people, going back to Hafiz through Bashar. The left should have no business saying anything good about him. That doesn't mean we want the U.S. to intervene militarily. There are like 13 countries and militias that came in. All of them were counter-revolutionaries. There was a democratic uprising as part of the Arab Spring. You had the Assad regime, which is a patrimonial, it's a family-run, it's just not religious, although they do promote the religion. It's just not their religious people or like in Saudi Arabia. And the other counter-revolution was the Islamists, which we actually helped, tolerated funding. And when we did intervene, it wasn't against Assad, it was against ISIS with the Kurds who are now abandoning for the 3rd damn time. It's just, no wonder people around the world think we're the most dangerous country in the world. But that can change. We got a lot of wealth that we can help the world develop, and that's, I think, the best way to promote peace and security. All right.